right, let's start. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yana Martin from the Language Institute at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and I'm very happy to welcome you to the last session of our Spring 2022 Language Collaboratory series. The Language Collaboratory is a partnership for the advancement of intercollegiate dialogue and the teaching of languages and cultures, driven by language centers and institutes at the University of Iowa, the University of Michigan, the University of Minnesota, Michigan State University, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Our aim is to provide collaborative professional learning opportunities for educators of language, culture, and literature at the 5 institutions. Today's session concludes our goal for this year, furthering conversations on the topic of student engagement. We have addressed this issue from 2 perspectives. First was research, and 2, pedagogical and practical. As always, we aim to share insights and to encourage interinstitutional dialogue, bridging institutional distance and fostering a collaborative interchange of ideas. You're invited to contribute to what we hope will be a lively discussion. The sessions are recorded and made available through each institution's website. We ask that you mute your microphone at the outset, that you use the tools in Zoom to contribute questions and comments in the chat. During the open discussion period, please raise your hand virtually prior to activating your microphone. Closed captioning will be available through the live transcript button in the Zoom menu bar. Today, I am really pleased to introduce Carl Blyth. Dr. Blyth is an applied linguist with a background in interactional sociolinguistics, pragmatics, and technology. His research lies at the intersection of language, culture, and interaction with a focal interest in second language pragmatics. He directs the Center for Open Educational Resources and Language Learning, one of the 16 federally funded foreign language resource centers around the country. Currently, he is writing a monograph entitled Lingua Culture, From Threshold Concept to Transformative Learning. He also recently published a co-edited book with Dr. Joshua Thoms from Utah State University entitled Open Education and Foreign Language Learning and Teaching, The Rise of a New Knowledge Ecology, published by Multilingual Matters in 2021. In today's session, Dr. Blyth will present Transforming Second Language Identities, the Affordances of Multilingual Life Writing. And just a quick note, after today's session, you will receive an email inviting you to provide feedback about the session today. So please consider providing your input because we really appreciate your comments. And now, with no further ado, let's begin.
Okay, thank you so much for that introduction, Yana, and welcome everybody. This is the bitter end of the semester, so I'm glad that we have so many participants here today to talk about increasing student engagement. I'm going to share my screen here. Let's see. Okay, I'll share my desktop with you. Okay, I hope you can see that. Everybody can see that fine? Okay, let me hide then, do a little bit of desktop cleanup. Here we go. All right, so the title is In Transforming L2 Identities, the Affordances of Multilingual Life Writings, and I've actually pluralized the writings here, the word writings, because a multilingual life writing is a genre, and so we're looking at different subgenres of that larger, that super category. And I also want to give a shout out to my partner in crime here. It's Marie-Lise Riard, who's a graduate student, a doctoral candidate in the Department of French and Italian, and she's writing her dissertation right now, so in French linguistics. So none of this could have happened without Marie-Lise's input. So let's jump right into it. I know that we have let's see, about 15 minutes. And there we go. So the basic frame here is multiliteracies and multiliteracies pedagogy from the New London group, and in particular, Coping Collaboratory. I'm going to kind of jump right over that and presuppose that people are somewhat familiar with this. We're also going to be borrowing heavily from Multilingual Subject, the construct of Claire Crampsha's book in 2009. And then the new idea here is multilingual life writing from Natalie Edwards, who's a British professor of French studies. And I also want to give a shout out to, again, Marie-Lise Riard, who has published recently in second language research and practice an article on becoming a legitimate L2 speaker, the role of non-traditional speaker models. So please go and take a look at that if this topic interests you. So here are the books then that I think inform what we're trying to do. Pedagogy of Multiliteracies. This is the Learning by Design Pedagogy of Cope and Calansis. Claire Crampsha's book, Multilingual Subject, where she looks at the development of a multilingual subjectivity. And then finally, the different genres of multilingual life writing. So also the other frame that's very important for understanding, I think, our research and what we're trying to do, these courses that we're developing, is the construct of narrative itself. And in particular, narrative is data and narrative is method. And Barquizan has et al. In their book on narrative in applied linguistics has a very good quote. A narrative inquiry is both complementary to experiment, observation, survey, and other research methods, and an alternative paradigm for social research. We also are borrowing from the work of Barbara Johnstone, who's a sociolinguist, but looking at discourse. And she wrote a terrific book in 1996 on the linguistic individual. And she says that the purpose of narrating is precisely the creation of an autonomous, unique self in discourse. And finally, we want to underline lots of applied linguists who have used narrative as data in their studies of the development of identity and through language learning, and of course, such as the work of Pavlenko and Lantoff. But our basic research question, and so I'm kind of framing this as both research as well as curriculum development, and that is, the question was, what are the affordances of multilingual life writings for the development of L2 identities and multilingual subjectivities? Now, multilingual life writing as a genre simply means a multilingual writing about their life, which is pretty general. It can take the form of a narrative, but it can also take the form of essays and even poetry. So we developed two different courses, and I'm going to quickly go over them. We can come back to any of this, but one course, 371, was actually a senior level stylistics course, but taught from a sociolinguistic angle. So the focus was on sociolinguistic variation in French and how linguistic choices construct identity. And in particular, this was taught by Marie-Lise 2 to 3 years ago, and she wanted them to explore this notion of linguistic variation through the creation of a fictional character that they developed throughout the course. And she also borrowed heavily from a book called Le Bleu des Abeilles by Laura Alcoba, who was an Argentinian writer who writes in French. That was kind of the primary model that they were using. My course, which was 351C, kind of an arbitrary number, the multilingual self, of course, is a riff on Crampsha's The Multilingual Subject. And here the whole point was to explore L2 identities through this new multilingual genre in French. It was an advanced class, and we were looking at then the available narrative designs of this particular genre. And I also wanted to emphasize the notion of identity, of narration as identity construction. Lots of social psychologists have talked about that. So we are our narratives, that kind of idea. And basically, I had them do 3 large writings. We started with what I'm calling a languocultural autobiography. So they describe themselves in 3 pages in the target language in terms of their languages and cultures. Next, we write a personal narrative, 6 pages in the target language, and we basically write multiple drafts of that throughout the semester, borrowing from the available designs of the different authors. And then we do a sociolinguistic interview. They write that in English. So here are a couple of the books. Senegal Abroad is written by Maya Angelou Smith. It's an ethnography of the Senegalese diaspora communities in New York, in Paris, and in Rome. Laura Alcoba, I just mentioned Le Bleu des Abeilles. She's an Argentinian writer, so a native Spanish speaker, but who writes in French. And of course, Alice Kaplan was the former chair of French studies at Yale University. So very different narratives, of course, about language, of learning French as an L2. In addition, Nancy Houston is a Canadian writer, an Anglophone that did a study abroad when she was 20 years old and never really went back. And we looked at these essays, this collection of essays, Nord Perdu, which is a concept of basically losing your orientation. Here, the notion of north, true north, and losing your true north, and the disorientation that can come from being between two different languages and cultures. Another novel that we read excerpts from, Rue, by Kim Thuy. She's a Quebecoise Vietnamese writer. An absolutely beautiful book. It won National Book Award in Canada in 2015. It's almost like poetry in prose, I would say. Suleiman Diamanka is a slam poet. He is, my students absolutely loved him. He is a Senegalese born, but grew up in Bordeaux. And so his family moved to France when he was 2 years old. So he's bilingual in French and Pulaar, one of the languages spoken in Senegal. So just to give you a little bit of kinds of the input that they were receiving. So what we did at the end of our courses, we of course had meta-pragmatic reflections that were built into the course. And I actually gave many of them throughout the semester, but Marie-Lise gave one at the beginning and one at the end. And then we got together and started coding according to grounded theory coding practices, but basically looking at the thematics of all of our data and trying to narrow them down. So let's jump right to the findings. What did we find? What was the effect of reading all of these different forms of multilingual life writings? Well, I'm going to, because I know that we're short on time, cut down on some of the examples, but let me give you this. These are some of my students. As a result of taking this course, my ideas about multilingualism have changed. Multilingualism in my head had always been a source of pain and suffering. For many of the authors that we read, it was not that way. Now, I want to point out that this was by a very balanced bilingual. She was native in French and also native in English. She grew up in the United States. So not all of them are L2 learners that we think about. I had a huge amount of multilingualism. I had people who spoke Tagalog, Hindi, many different languages. Of course, since this was at the University of Texas, a lot of bilinguals from the Rio Grande Valley, so they spoke both French, English, and Spanish. Shilpa, an Indian American, says, I thought that multilingualism was an attribute that only a select group of people could have, those who could speak multiple languages perfectly. Yes, the word perfectly comes back a lot in these reflections. After going through this course, I feel that being multilingual is no longer such an unattainable quality for me because I no longer feel such an immense pressure to speak French, my second language, perfectly. Okay, so they basically thought that multilingualism meant being a balanced bilingual and having perfect competences in all languages that you speak. Not true. Many of our students commented about the notion of feeling free to be themselves in the second language and what it feels like to finally be liberated. Isidore, of course, these are all pseudonyms, by the way. Isidore writes, we've looked at so many different multilingual francophones and their unique stories. There is no one way to be or one specific kind of person that has a legitimate claim over the language. And here, of course, they're picking up our own discourse, that of their professors, talking about language ownership and language legitimacy. But it did give them a meta language for talking about their own feelings towards the language. Chloe writes, I feel much more comfortable with my grasp of the language and even have full conversations in French with my friends who also study it. During these conversations, I'm also more willing to code switch than before. While I used to see languages as distinct and mutually exclusive systems of communication, I now see them as tools that can be employed, swapped, and even blended together to convey meaning, which I now do much more often in my everyday life. So we also, I should mention that in the narratives, they did a tremendous amount of translanguaging. They would like narrate the action in French, but then their inner thoughts were in English. A lot of our students talked about the universality of the L2 experience, because even though these were very different writers and who came from different backgrounds, there was something similar about all of them. So Jared says, Le Bleu des Abeilles was a memorable text for me. I was very invested in reading about the young Argentinian girl who tries to fit into her new French school. Even though the main character was younger than I was, the character in the book was 10 years old, so a little girl. The theme of intégration really resonated with me in my experiences of trying to fit in at a French lycée. So Jared wrote his narrative about his home family, his host family, and the year that he spent in France at a lycée. Eris writes, I really appreciated this course because we read multiple texts from not only multilinguals, but non-native French speakers, and it gave me a sense of comfort. There's that word again, comfort, knowing I'm not the only one feeling this way alongside my classmates. Okay. So then on the flip side, they also wrote about their particularity because they were individuals after all. So while they shared this universal arc of language learning, there was also something particular about each of them. Wilfred writes, once I found out that my French had somehow been heavily influenced by the Southern French accent, I had a much more enjoyable time learning French, as I wondered why I always seemed to say things wrong or different compared to other speakers. This poor guy had just come out of a corrective phonetics course, and he had discovered that he had picked up, because he'd spent a year in the south of France, and he had some dialectal variations, and he was taught that that was wrong, and he had to get rid of it. So for me, I think that the Parisian way of speaking is analogous to New York in English, and the Southern French accent reminds me more of my own Southern roots. He was from Texas. I have another student, Matt, who loved everything about Canadian French, and he writes, for various reasons, Quebec became a particularly fascinating place to me over time. And I feel a certain closeness to Francophone Canada, despite having no legitimate connections to the country or province. When Marie-Lise, I actually asked Marie-Lise to come visit our class and talk about her research. When Marie-Lise discussed students feeling a certain connection to different Francophone regions and accents, I felt a level of recognition and legitimization in a way, because I'd always viewed my interest as somewhat unusual. Many French teachers get confused when you start using words like char, breuvage, magasiner, cellulaire. These, of course, are Canadianisms, but I had always adopted them before their metropolitan counterparts. So we also, a very important part of what they talked about in their reflections was their life-defining experiences. And I'll just use this slide here to summarize them. My students wrote narratives, and of course it was up to them to choose their own life-defining experiences, and they were all over the map. I had one student, a Spanish-English bilingual, who talked about interpreting how she became the interpreter for her family. Her parents were largely Spanish speakers, and then because of her birth order, she moved to the United States, having established Spanish as her first language, and yet she picked up English enough to be then the interpreter during crises of her family. And then another story about working in a department store and meeting and greeting these Francophones, and she spent 2 hours with them and sold them lots of merchandise, and so she was a moment of success. A high school crush on a French exchange student that doesn't go as planned, and so forth. Another theme that came out of our analysis was this notion of projective identity that we're borrowing from Jim G, who has worked on multiliteracies, and particularly in digital gaming environments, and talking about how you have freedom to play with your identity. And here they're talking literally about their characters, developing a character in this kind of fictional world in Marie-Lise's class. So Françoise says, I imagine my character as a future me who is studying abroad, and I feel like the reason I have sometimes felt limited in creating her is because I don't want to imagine too far ahead for myself. I want to explore a version of her that has become more integrated into her surroundings. So they did talk a lot about how they were using their characters as a foil to their own personalities, or as a means to get into, to play with their own identities. So let me sum things up, and we can get right to the Q&A and talk more deeply about the courses. So what are the affordances of multilingual life writings? Well, first of all, they're multilingual writings plus meta reflections, plus time and space to actually think about things. And that we think are, it led to two different things, two, I think, outcomes. And that was a better understanding of the French-speaking world. They started focusing on not only dialectal differences, sociolectal differences, but even personalities and how people are linguistic individuals also in the target language, something that really they hadn't thought about before. It also led to a much better understanding of themselves. And I think this is important for, I think, the theme of the Collaboratory, and that is, of course, how do we engage our students in the content? One point that is made in multilingual pedagogy is to make sure that the content is relevant with the learner's life world. And the notion of relevance is really, we say, well, that's up to you to define the relevance. So what is the relevance? But they have to have time and space to reflect on that for themselves and to build that bridge between the narrator of the text and then themselves. Both of our courses promoted diversity and inclusion by presenting life narratives of multilingual speakers and using them as models. So not the kind of privileged or the kind of essentialist models that we typically find in pedagogical materials. And yeah, we wanted definitely to rehabilitate silenced voices that we don't find in these material in L2 education, such as multilinguals. And also we believe that it promoted diversity by encouraging learners to explore and cultivate their diversity and uniqueness as linguistic individuals. So in conclusion, I think we both had different approaches to multilingual life writings, but we actually had similar affordances. Similar affordances in terms of that everyone got a chance to explore their own multilingualism as it was growing. But at the same time, it was somewhat different because in my course, we really talked a lot about rethinking the past. Where did you come from? How did your salient events, the events that you remember, how do you put them together and create a coherent life narrative? Whereas Marie-Lise's course was much more about imagining the future self through the creation of this fictional character. So basically, we want to encourage other people when they're thinking about the curriculum to carve out more space for this kind of reflective thinking about one's own language identity, but also the impact then of studying languages and cultures on their identity. It has helped our students in then two ways. It helped them reflect about themselves as individuals, so that, of course, is through their first person narratives, but then also kind of thinking more largely, this meta reflection about what is the universal arc of language learning? What does it feel like? Okay, so let me, those are some of our main references, and I'd be really happy, really interested in talking to you and finding out what you think. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We have virtual clapping, we have real clapping. Yeah, this is really awesome, very inspirational. So we do have, I would like to invite you please to post questions. You can comment, you can, if you did something similar, feel free to share that with us. So
while we wait for questions, I actually have one.
Yeah.
Thank you, Carl. This has been really encouraging. I was wondering, what are your thoughts in terms of your recommendation of integrating more reflection into other courses, and in particular, the two targeted courses for your study were more at the higher level of proficiency. So I'm wondering how you see that happening at the lower level curriculum.
Well, yeah, and the reason it came about as a higher level, but both of these were in upper division courses, even senior level, was simply because we had more freedom to play with the curriculum. There's less wiggle room and sometimes multi-section courses that are trying to dictate a curriculum and keep everybody on the syllabus at the same time. So, but of course, the general notion of a multilingual life writing and then plus reflection can certainly be embedded, and I think should be embedded all the way up, starting from the beginning and going to the very end of their language studies. Because the idea is that while people who have developed a sensibility, they actually had, our students in both of these courses, as I mentioned, were already had a sense of themselves as being multilingual. But many of the students, when they're starting out, when they're called incipient bilinguals, if you want to use that term, they don't see themselves at all as on a bilingual spectrum or a trajectory. So it's really great to start that, even with just a 1 or 2 texts and a couple of discussions, I think would go a long way.
Yeah, we have a hand up.
Okay, Mary Ellen.
Hi, Carl. Thanks so much for your talk. I'm really excited about this, and kind of building off of Adolfo's question. And I was glad to hear that a lot of the learners that you worked with kind of already had a sense of themselves as being multilingual. I know in the program I'm in now, rather than saying like, oh, what do native speakers say? We try to say like, what do other, we don't try to set that up as the be all and end all of a speaker. I teach German. So we might say, okay, that an advanced speaker of German could understand your text or something like that. Were there kind of other things that you had wished, or Mary-Lise had wished that like students had been better set up to understand maybe coming into? Because I feel like there were maybe a lot of these big aha moments. And I wonder if that could happen maybe earlier in the curriculum, especially because I tend to teach earlier in the curriculum.
Yeah, well, I think all of them, I mean, it was a general finding that even the ones who identified themselves as bilingual, multilingual, still seem to think of bilingualism, multilingualism as balanced, and that their competences, even though we had, this led into discussions about, as I mentioned, in Texas, we have a very high level of bilingualism in the Spanish-speaking community. And so I would ask them, so is your Spanish just like your English? Can you do the same thing in both? And of course, they quickly talked about asymmetries between their languages, even though they had a very definite sense of themselves as being bilingual. And that, of course, since this was a shared experience, one person's narrative prompted another person's narrative. So the people who were talking about what it felt like to be a Spanish speaker speaking English, people said, yeah, it's similar to me in Hindi. I grew up as a heritage speaker. My parents speak Hindi, but I'm really much better at English. On the other hand, so it just went back and forth. I even had a Senegalese student, or she was born in Senegal and then came to the United States. So she grew up speaking French and Wolof as her 2, I guess, primary languages. But then, of course, when she was a child, she learned English, and English, she had said, had overtaken both her French and her Wolof. So people, just through sharing, and it really prompted, people started prompting each other, because that's what happens when you tell a narrative. People start to think about themselves and their own narratives. Just through this sharing, they got a much better vision of what linguistic competence was going to be. And it didn't take a lot of preaching on my part. They kind of let go of the native speaker as the ideal. The native speaker wasn't the ideal, because what we were focusing on, without telling them so heavy-handedly, as the MLA reports, 2007, the educated translingual moving back and forth between different frames, being somewhat aware that of their own multilingualism and this ability, the affordances of being able to move back and forth between the two. So yeah, I had a lot of students who, as I gave you that one quote because I wanted you to, about a student who had a lot of complexes about her own multilingualism. And she actually, when she started the course, after the first day, she came out, second day, she came up to me and she burst into tears. And so I've been looking for this course all my life, because my parents tell me that I don't speak le vrai français. Je parle français couramment. I speak fluent French, I dream in French, I'm French. But yet they tell me I'm still not French. And so she had a lot of baggage, even though she was perhaps the best example of a balanced bilingual. So it helped them really rethink, oh, this isn't the ideal. Balanced bilinguals have problems too, or hangups too. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you. And it's we're right up on the hour, so it's a little bit after 4. I think at this point, Adolfo, we will turn off the recording. But for those